That was great. There's so many great truths that she had to share with us, and a lot of those things, hopefully you guys have picked up throughout the day. But just that whole idea of relaxing and letting yourself refocus on what's important to you now is one of the best ways to fight some of that fear and uncertainty. And sort of one of the things that I'm going to draw off that she was talking about educating others. Sometimes that can be hard to do. How do you tell people what your story is? And I had this happen to me a number of times when I went. I'd be in the line at Starbucks to get a coffee, and I'd see an old friend, and they'd be like, "Oh, hey, Mike, how are you doing? What are you up to these days?" And what do you say to that? Like, "Oh, I'm doing some chemotherapy, a little bit of radiation. I lost my hair, and I'm feeling terrible." And then, how are you doing? It's really hard to tell that story, right? It's hard to engage in those types of conversations with people, and that's why something I'm really passionate about, and I'm grateful that Jill mentioned it. Is knowing how to tell your story and knowing how to sort of educate others, I guess, on what's happening to you is really important to help you sort of make that transition back into your life. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for a few minutes is just how storytelling can really help us in a lot of different ways. And I'm just going to tell you guys my story really briefly, and then I'm going to show a little video clip of a group of young adult cancer survivors actually telling their stories and how that sort of impacted them. But yes, first, what is storytelling? And there's all the simple ones, writing a book, or filming a movie, or like I mentioned, standing in line, at Starbucks. There's things like going out for dinner with friends. How are you supposed to go out with your friends and talk about what's happening to you or the difficulties you have transitioning back? That's storytelling as well. Sitting around a table with a group of friends, those are telling stories. Or talking on the phone with relatives. I don't know if you guys have done a lot of that, but I did a lot of that. Sort of trying to tell the story of what was happening to me and explain it in a way that they could understand, and sort of help me, I guess, instead of me constantly having to help them. That was really difficult for me. All those conversations that I had over and over and over with all my relatives who live all far away, that was really difficult. But that's a piece, that's telling your story right there. So it's not just this really formal idea of, book or movie or, blog or whatever. It's all these interactions that you have on a daily basis with other people in your life. And so why do stories matter? They matter because also in educating others, they also sort of help you educate yourself too, as you start to understand what's happening to you. You start to process when you speak things out loud. And there's a bunch of research studies done about people when they either write their story down or speak their story out loud, they're able to take these thoughts that don't really have much meaning up here in their head, but when they actually process them, turn them into words, and then speak them, all of a sudden they can start to understand some of these things that they're going through. And we got to hear so many stories of, survivor stories today, and it's pretty cool to see how they've been able, you can tell they've been able to process some of the things that's happened to them by telling it to others. And not everyone does that in the same way standing up front here, but just maybe in those everyday conversations, it helps you to process what you've been going through. I'm going to read just a little quote by a doctor named Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, and it's about storytelling, and it's something that's really shaped sort of my survivorship journey and the way that I've sort of been able to heal from this difficult cancer experience. And she says, "Everybody is a story, and sharing our stories with others is how wisdom is passed along. Our stories are a front row seat to the real experience. We become in that moment a guest in someone else's life, and together with them sit at the feet of their teacher. The meaning we may draw from someone's story may be different from the meaning they themselves have drawn. No matter. Facts bring us to knowledge, but stories lead to wisdom." And that's why we have so many survivors sharing their stories at this session, because we really believe, that the way that you'll be able to take some of this information and this knowledge that you've sort of gained from all these different lectures and actually apply it to your life and to help you live the best life that you can, is really through listening to these stories about how other people have done it. It's one of the best ways to sort of process that information and to learn how to apply it in a practical and tangible way to your life. And so I think this is where I tell my own story. Hey, there it is. All right. So I'm just going to share a little bit of my story, and then we're going to talk about how to tell your story a little bit. But this is me during chemotherapy. That's my wife, Bonnie. And you may notice I lost all my hair, but I never lost my beard. And so every time I went in to see my doctor, he'd like tug on it and be like, man, it's still in there so good. And I was like, yeah, we had this like inside joke that it was the secret to my strength was my beard. So I was pretty proud about that. But this is sort of really briefly our story, me and Bonnie's story. So I was living the dream. 2008, I was working as a ski patroller in Whistler, BC in the winters, and then in the summer I was working as an adventure guide with at-risk youth. And so I was taking inner city kids from gang members and things like that, bringing them out and doing adventure activities with them. So taking them rock climbing and rafting and doing things on the challenge course and just basically getting them out of this really toxic situation that they were in at home just for a couple weeks, so that they could really, so we could invest in their lives and tell them how valuable they are and sort of hopefully help them make some changes in the way they were going. And because of that, I was living a very physically active lifestyle. I was outside like 300 days a year. So I spent more time outside than I did inside, even sleeping actually, because we'd often be camping with them when we were outside. And so obviously the farthest thing from my mind was any sort of illness, let alone cancer. And so at the end of 2008, me and my wife got married, and I started having these sort of breathing issues. I guess I had them for a while, but I didn't really notice them. And so eventually Bonnie sort of noticed in me that I was starting to I was getting pretty skinny, losing a lot of weight, and having all these issues which I thought was asthma. And she's like, you better go to the doctor. And so I went to the doctor a number of times, maybe 5 or 6 times, to try different asthma medications, because I was pretty convinced that's what it was. And at the last appointment that I had, one of the nurses there asked me on my way out of the office, she sort of walked after me and said, hey, Mike, do you ever get itchy feet or itchy hands? And I was like, yeah, all the time. I can't stop itching my feet and my hands. And for some incredible reason, she just read this article about how itchy feet and itchy hands can be a symptom of Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer, and that it occurs fairly regularly in people my age. And so she's like, well, we better get you a chest x-ray to make sure that everything's all right. And so they did the chest x-ray, and that's where they found this grapefruit-sized tumor in the middle of my chest, which had been causing all my breathing issues. It actually had been pushing my lungs out of the way so that my lungs were about at 50% capacity. And so this had been happening while I was out skiing and hiking and climbing and doing all this stuff. All this stuff had been happening to me without me knowing. And it was obviously an incredible shock to who I was and to what I thought I was. And so my wife and I, we had to move back from Washington State, where we were living, overnight, back to Calgary to move in with my parents. Being 5 months married, that's a little awkward, living with your in-laws. So that transition was really difficult. But as soon as I got back, I started treatments. And so I did 6 months of chemotherapy and a month and a half of radiation. And it was actually, because I was in pretty good shape, I tolerated the treatments pretty well, the doctors told me. And, I still got all the nausea and the just general yucky feeling and the, sleeping all the time, the fatigue, all that stuff. But one of the hardest things for me was actually this whole idea of why me? Why me? And it's a question I think everyone asks when they get diagnosed with cancer. And for me, I was just like, man, I was out there like helping these kids turn around their lives, How could God do this to me? You're like, why? Why me? And that question made me really angry and really bitter. And I was worried about that because I was never an angry, bitter person in my entire life. I'd always been someone who was wanting to help others and sort of upbeat and willing to, I guess, put myself out there for the benefit of others. And I didn't want to become this angry, bitter person that just hated the world, and that's what I was turning into. And so at one point in my journey, I was sort of just laying in the basement, face down, just being so angry, just like hitting the ground. I would go punch a wall, but I was living at home with my parents, and so I didn't want to get them mad at me. So I was just hitting the ground, like, why, God, why me? And for some reason, I was just laying there, and I felt this weird sense of peace sort of come over me, and I can't explain it in any way. But for some reason, at that moment, I realized that I needed to engage with what was happening to me. This was going to consume me. Even if I lived, I had a good chance of survival. Emotionally, this was going to destroy me unless I did something. And I realized I had to engage with what was happening to me. Because up until that point, I'd just been sitting in the basement, watching TV with my eyes closed, waiting for this time to be over so that, eventually I could just get on with my life and forget about this whole cancer thing. And that, that avoidance was not a good path for me to go, because it was just feeding this anger and this bitterness. And so one of the ways for me to engage with it is that I had this crazy idea. And I thought, you know what? Before I was diagnosed with cancer, I used to run these trips with kids. Maybe I should try and run an adventure trip with young adult cancer survivors, because up until that point, I'd never seen any young adults who had had cancer. I was the only one in the room that was my age. And I thought, there's got to be some out there, and they've got to be dealing with some of the same issues as me. And so I said, you know what, let's try and do a trip with cancer survivors. And then we started talking to the survivors who were coming, and they started telling me their stories. I was like, man, these are incredible stories. We need to share these with people. And so we came up with this idea to make a film. And so that's it right there. Wrong Way to Hope, a story of young adults and cancer. And we filmed this whole trip. It took us a year to put it together. And just this last year, we were able to take the film across the country, starting in Victoria all the way to Halifax. And we got to show it in almost every major cancer center, including this one, actually, across the country, to over 1,400, healthcare professionals. And we did other screenings for survivors and supporters. And, we were able to do 52 screenings last year. And the feedback that we got from it was people were really surprised. They thought they were coming to watch a movie about young adults and cancer. But everyone, no matter what their age, connected with the film on a pretty deep level, because they were universal issues that people are dealing with. Things like relationships and fear and uncertainty and identity and all those different things that you have to deal with when you get diagnosed with cancer. Those were universal things that everyone was facing. And so after that, the trip went so well that we decided that we'd do some more trips. So we started this little nonprofit called Survive and Thrive Expeditions, and we're still running trips. We're running 3 trips this summer with young adult survivors. And a group called Young Adult Cancer Canada saw the film, and they loved it so much they hired me. And so I started working with them. And so I got to facilitate all these retreats and conferences and support groups for young adult survivors with Young Adult Cancer Canada. And then Livestrong saw the film, and they invited me down to their annual conference as one of their main speakers to show the film. And so I got to show the film down there. And then we decided to make another film, which we're going to show in a little bit about storytelling. And then Janine hired me to work at CancerBridges. And the only reason I tell you all that, stuff is because of that one decision that I made to sort of engage with what was happening to me. And it's fundamentally sort of altered the course of my life. And it was all around this sort of simple equation that me and Bonnie came up with, as finding a way to sort of integrate your life before cancer with your life after cancer or with cancer, finding a way to bring those two together to find what's called sort of a new normal, because things will never be the same again. That's something that I struggled with for a long time, was coming to that realization that things are not going to be the same. But if I'm able to sort of take pieces of my life before and integrate them with pieces of my life now, it's just incredible the way that it can sort of unfold in a positive way, which I'd never expected. And I hear that over and over from all the survivors that we get to talk to. It's just incredible the way that this can happen. And so one of the things we talked about is, how do we find this new normal? And this is something we talk about on our trips a lot. Is we just, often we just sit around the campfire and tell stories to each other, all the young adults there. And it's incredible what they can learn from each other. And one of the things we came up with on one of these evenings out in the wilderness talking to each other was these three points. And the first one was reflect. Is you need to have time to reflect on what's happened to you and how you've changed and what sort of where you want to go from now. You need to spend time to actually think about what just happened to you, unlike me, just trying to push it off and not deal with it. And the next thing that we found out, is you need to take some time to refocus from there. Once you've had time to sort of reflect on what's happened to you and the changes that have occurred in your life, you need to refocus on what's important to you now. Where do I want to go from here? What's most important to me? Before, the most important thing for me was to climb big mountains and to take kids in the backcountry. And that wasn't going to happen anymore because of some long-term effects that I had. So I needed to refocus on what I wanted my life to be now, moving forward. And then finally, you need to take time to rebuild your life. And these things all go together. And we found that a lot of young adults, I think a lot of cancer patients in general, just feel this intense pressure to just sort of put it behind them and move on with their life. And we get that everywhere, from society from your employers. They think cancer's over, just get on with it. Seriously, what are you waiting for? And they don't give people time to reflect, refocus, and rebuild their lives after they've finished treatments. And so I just, if there's any encouragement from my story for you guys, it's just to actually take that time for yourself, because it will benefit you in the long run. And we have a lot of young adult survivors coming on our trips who are a year or 2, 3 years out of treatments, and they can't figure out why their life is terrible and why they hate where their life is going. And it's because they didn't actually take this time to reflect or focus and rebuild their lives after they'd finished. So in conclusion, I'm still living the dream. It looks a lot different than it was. I'm not a ski patroller. I'm not working with kids, and it's not easy. We still haven't been able to rebuild financially. We still have to live at home with my parents. There's still all these different residual. I have some inflammation, like I was talking about, of my heart lining, which is painful when I do heavy exercise. There's all these different things that still occur, and it will never be the same, but it's still awesome. I'm still living the dream, and I really can say that. And it's incredible that I was able to get to that place, because I never thought that I would. I really didn't think I would. And one of the best ways to do that is just to realize that cancer is just a piece of who we are. It's not all of who we are. If we can figure out a way to sort of incorporate this cancer piece into our life and not let it become who we are, that's the best way to sort of make the rest of your life the best of your life, to sort of live in a way that, that your life is going to not be dragged down completely by this cancer experience that you've gone through. So I'm going to share a little film that we made actually on our last trip with young adult survivors in the summer. We did a sailing trip with young adults. And this is a great picture of it. This is sort of what we do. We'd sail around for all day, and then we'd find a beautiful campsite, start a fire, and we'd sit there, and the survivors would share stories with each other. And it was incredible the amount of wisdom that they were able to gain from those stories. And I'm hoping that, you guys, even though this film is sort of focused on young adults with cancer, that you'll be able to resonate with the themes in the same way that young adults can resonate with some of the themes that older people deal with. So yeah, it's called Ebb and Flow, which is perfect segue from Jill's presentation, because it deals with those ebb and flows of emotion in life. So here we go. The amazing thing about being diagnosed with cancer is that all of a sudden you have a very defined conflict in your life. You have a very defined struggle and difficulty and suffering. You have suffering in your life. And those are things that are missing from a whole lot of people's lives in North America. And it forces you to live a story, to live a different story. In real stories, there's so many different plot lines and things happening at once. It's very difficult to categorize them into different phases. But the classical 5-phase story structure is sometimes a good place to start to help survivors to view their cancer journey as a story. 5 phases of a story are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Typically, the cancer journey starts out with someone living their life either enjoying it or hating it.
I didn't know what was going on. I thought it was a normal phase because I was 18, I was just tired, I was exhausted, and so I was getting into fights with my mom all the time, and said to her, I said, I don't want to move out, I don't want to leave things the way they are, what do you want me to do? And she goes, Christine, I'd really like you to go to the doctors. And I said, okay, I can do that, that's simple. And so I went to the doctors, and she My doctor just said, oh, it's your antidepressants, just increase your dose.
A little summer gig riding a bike downtown Vancouver. It's kind of like a messenger. End of June, I guess, I started noticing heavy symptoms, very off balance and dizzy, which was trouble riding a bike, especially when you're just trying to weave between people's side mirrors at intersections and stuff, right?
Before I was diagnosed, I was working in a restaurant, and I didn't really know what I wanted. I knew I wanted to go back to school, but I had no clue what direction I was going in.
The introduction of the conflict is the diagnosis of cancer, and the rising action is all the initial struggles and difficulties around the cancer diagnosis and getting into treatments and things like that.
So I told my mom I'm going to see a blood specialist at the oncology unit at Oshawa. So I remember driving home that night in the car, and I remember exactly where we were, and we were turning, and I said, there's no way I have leukemia, there's no way. Like, that's just impossible. That just sounded so funny to me at the time. When we got home, within an hour or two, the doctor called and talked to my mom on the phone, and my mom handed me the phone, and they told me that I had leukemia.
I was misdiagnosed by 5 different doctors. I had a brain tumor growing, and it had split whatever the skin is to your brain, so I was bleeding to the brain, and I guess I was hemorrhaging. And I guess right about then they called the ambulance. Got me in under a scan though, and within the hour they had me from Langley to New West and under the knife, or so they say. I tell everyone that story, right?
So when I finally got my ultrasound, basically the pathologists came out and say, you have to stay here to do a mammogram. And then she said, next week, you get the earliest biopsy appointment. And then everything just kept rolling like that. And of course, finally, it was, came out to be cancer.
I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in December 2009. I was 21. It was pretty scary to have to spend a month in a hospital and spend a night.
The climax moment is usually a decision that that person makes, that I'm not going to be angry or bitter or disillusioned anymore. I'm going to look at this cancer and deal with it in a way that it adds something to my life instead of taking away from my life.
Had my portacath in. I got it put in April of 2006, and at the Ac retreat I had been holding on to it because I was afraid if I got it out that it was a way of the cancer coming back.
Am I the hand you'll choose to fold?
And at the Ac retreat, I realized that that's when I realized that I had let the cancer define who I really was, and that needed to stop. And the first thing I thought of was the portacath is holding me back, is keeping me from, like, if I can take that out, that's a piece of me that's gone from that, and it's not all of me, it's just a piece that I don't need anymore.
The one thing that we don't need, one thing that's holding us back. So that's what this candle represents. And we're gonna light it.
God's silent voice saying yes, no, maybe yes. Saying yes, no, maybe yes. Maybe yes.
I feel like I'm about to make some sort, I don't know what it is, but I'm about to make some sort of decision. It's just, I never really felt like I don't know, almost had a purpose, you know? So, but now I feel like I want to have some impact on life, or my life, someone's life. I want to have a life with meaning, not just going through the motions, doing what I think I should be doing.
And then typically the following action phase is once they've made that decision, things go even worse. And they start to feel like they were stupid for making that type of decision or stupid for trying to view things that way. It's where friends and family fall away. It's usually where all the difficulties, the major amount of difficulties in a cancer journey occur.
I would say the post-treatment challenges are definitely more difficult than the treatment itself. The post-treatment is getting back to life. When people might expect you to be back to your normal, like when your life and your mentality is forever changed.
Like I wouldn't leave the house for like a week, you know what I mean? And that would bother my family, or or they wouldn't say anything, and they would just say, "Oh, you never did anything today." I just could sense their disappointment.
I don't find that I can get over my fears as easily as I used to be able to. And I believe that can't even think of the word, it stops me from moving on.
It's usually just a moment of letting go and just being like, this is what it is, and I'm just going to leave it there. And once that letting go has occurred, that's usually the final conflict. Then the resolution occurs, and they're able to come through this cancer thing in a completely different place. And this is true whether they are cured or not. It's often the same.
I've been through a valley of depression. Sort of feel sorry for myself and being a victim of cancer. That I felt that I've got out of that valley. I feel more motivated to being loved and to love someone, and to be gentle to myself and not caring about rewards or accomplishment.
It was kind of like cancer made me I feel like I'm a better person because of it, even though you don't want to say that, it's kind of how it is. It kind of sucks, but it's the truth. It was kind of a blessing in disguise, but I look back and I'm much happier being the way I am now than who I was then, because I wasn't happy then.
The interesting thing that we have discovered through listening to hundreds of cancer stories is that resolution does not necessarily come with remission. The resolution of a cancer journey really starts when a person touched by cancer begins to follow through on the decision they made to not let cancer define them. The reason I'm so passionate about getting survivors to tell their stories is because through telling their stories, they can give others hope. Telling that story allows other people to see that, you know what, maybe I won't always be this angry, or maybe I won't always be this bitter, or maybe I won't always be this frustrated with my life. There's an opportunity for movement there, and that gives people hope. One last piece of that story to share with you guys, and she's allowed me to, she said this is okay, share it with you guys, but Christina, the girl who talked about how she came through this and she likes who she is now better, and that it's made her a better person. Just so you know, like, she was diagnosed when she was 18, and because of her chemotherapy, she had to have both knees and both hips replaced. And so this has been a 7 or 8 year journey for her. where she has just been incapacitated by cancer. And it's incredible to think about the fact that she was able to go through that and say that at the end. It just shows the power of stories. It shows the power of people, cancer survivors like us, being able to share with each other about how we've been able to move through this into that survivorship phase. And so where could you start? Sometimes the 5 phases is a good way to sort of start, to learn, how to share what's happened to you with others, because that's going to help you sort of move forward and make new relationships and be able to go out for dinner with your friends and, all that type of stuff. Knowing what to share and how to share it is really important. And sometimes these 5 phases of a story can help. And it's not always that it's that complete. There's a lot of people who are mid-story and they don't know how things are shaping up. And, so it's not always the best way to do it, but it might be a good framework to start. And then the best way to do it is to practice with a supporter. Practice with someone that you know that loves you and cares for you, and you can just sit there and just talk to them and be like, I'm going to try and share in 3 minutes sort of what's happened to me. And it's a great way to be able to practice so that when you meet someone in the coffee shop, you can share with them just openly what's happened, and then be able to move through that and continue the conversation instead of it being so awkward. Hanging out with your friends, writing your story down, or even telling your story at something like this. If you think that's something that you could do, if you think that's something that would help you in your journey, that's what we want to provide for you guys. And so there will be opportunities if you sign up for the CancerBridges Survivor Network, opportunities to come and be able to share your story like the 4 survivors who've been able to today. So yeah, it's not something that's easy, but it's something that's pretty important. And so I think just if you got anything, just encourage you to think about what your story is and how you can share it. That's a good place to start.